Hi everyone, and welcome back for our second EverGive webinar. So it's great to be with you, have you with us again. Today we're diving into something I know that many of you have been curious about, and that's how EverGive really came to be, and then hearing directly from Groundswell project about how they're using Bitcoin in real life to drive real social impact. Similar to last time, I'll be your host. I'm Richard. I'll be guiding you through the session and at the end hosting the Q&A. We're joined by Gafar from Groundswell and Ishmael, one of the co-founders and CEO of EverGive. Today, it will probably be quite conversational. And as always, feel free to pop your questions in the chat as we go. We have got some Q&A, some questions from the previous session we'll be covering off. But if you have any questions that come up as we go through today, please pop them in the chat and we'll come back to them towards the end of the session. So without further ado, I will pass you over to our first speaker, Ishmael, to start talking to you about EverGive.
Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to have all of you here. So yeah, I'd just like to quickly go over why we built EverGive. So before EverGive, there were several products that we built, including My 10 Nights, and we had raised over £100 million for charities. And we had come to the stark realization that we weren't really moving the needle much in terms of like impact, but probably more painfully for charities is that we weren't solving an acute problem of constant fundraising, taking up a lot of their time and resources. So typically what happens, as you guys know, is donors give, charities spend, and then fundraise, and then that cycle just repeats. And so we wanted to solve that problem, the problem of financial instability for charities. So how do we put charities on a path to financial security? And what would the world look like? And what would your charities look like if every donation became infinite in its kind of like giving capabilities to your charity and your causes? So that's essentially the goal, the problem that we're trying to solve. How do we turn your donors into essentially investors in your cause? So there's limited options to do that currently. There's several endowment models out there, but they're quite lofty, quite inaccessible, and not very retail friendly to and retail facing to your customer base, and not very easy for charities to access at varying kind of entry points, whether that's a low amount of revenue or like a large amount of revenue. So we wanted to make the endowment model accessible to all charities of all sizes. And as you see here, the typical issue that everybody in our kind of modern fiat world faces, your reserves typically lose value every year, specifically if you're keeping it in cash. So it's not uncommon for fiat currency on average globally to be debased by approximately 10 to 15% a year, slightly higher than what we've kind of documented here. I'm sure Gafar is going to go into that in more kind of technical detail. But what we're trying to do is how do we make sure that your reserves grow with time and not vanish with time? So just in summary, quickly, the problem that we're trying to solve is charities' financial instability. We're trying to make more accessible and democratize a way where every charity can access long-term reserve technology, and we want to make sure that we're putting your energy and time and your donations in a technology that doesn't lose value but gains value over time. So yeah, Rich. So again, Gafar's going to go into this in more detail, but very high level. We've chosen Bitcoin as the perfect technology to be able to do all of the above. And then here's just a very kind of simple illustration in terms of its kind of store of value component. A donation of $100 in 2020, today, 5 years later, would be worth $76. And the equivalent donation in 2020 in Bitcoin would now be worth $1,200. And what we're not trying to do is have you just build out a Bitcoin reserve that you just never touch. That's not the point. The point is that you do benefit from this growing reserve, and you benefit from it in two ways, which we can come to later on. But again, very high level, you can either take out a percentage of the growth of the Bitcoin, and at some point in the future, you can borrow against it if you so wish. But the point here being that we've chosen Bitcoin as the asset that we solve the problem that we've kind of put forward today. Yeah, and here's again, I think Gafar might touch on this later, but using the smartest reserve for charities is essentially what I've been speaking about. Bitcoin, for a number of reasons, is the ideal technology. I mean, historically, it's performed better than other assets in the last year, the last 3 years, the last 5 years, and the last 10 years. Increasingly so, it's got institutional backing from nation states, corporations, and it's growing exponentially at the moment in terms of its adoption and its security. Again, Gafar might touch on this more in his kind of technical coverage of Bitcoin. But kind of the integrity of the Bitcoin protocol and the sheer energy deployed in keeping it intact, secure, is just gargantuan. So yeah, Rich. Yeah, so we have got off to a strong start. We've been experimenting very heavily over the last 9-10 months, and really pleased to share that we've got well over 20,000 donors from the public contributing to our Bitcoin reserve, primarily because they want a way where their impact can last longer than it otherwise would have done. And we're partnering up with some really impressive, cool charities doing great things around the world, notably Groundswell on this call, as well as the likes of Amnesty, the UN, Greenpeace, BBC Media Action, and many others who are now kind of alive to the potential of Bitcoin to completely transform not only fundraising, but long-term sustainable impact, and how having a long-term reserve kind of changes strategically how they think about impact. Rich?
Yeah, perfect. Thanks for that, Ishmael. No surprise that we've had questions in for you, so we'll cover those at the end, thinking about the future of EverGive, why Bitcoin a bit more and things like that. So we'll come back towards the end, but thank you for that. I'll pass over to Gafar now, who can start talking about the sort of real life impact that he's seeing using Bitcoin at Groundswell project.
Sure, thank you, Richard. So I hope most of you heard we're here last week, and we talked about the sort of the history of money, why fiat or monies that are forms of money that are weak, that we can create more of, have issues, of course, and so strong money has to have a limited supply and it has to fulfill various criteria. So that's how we got to the Bitcoin conversation that Ishmael just spoke about. Now, right now, I would say, we talked about debasement, examples of debasement in history, how various civilizations and empires debased their currency over time, and that eventually led to the collapse, at least the economic collapse, which then followed by the political collapse. Now, I'd say right now we're in what I would call late stage fiat. We're at the point where governments are still quite addicted to money printing as a way to solve economic problems. And you can only play that game so many times. You can only play that card so many times, and eventually gets to the point where things get very, very tenuous, which is where we are now. So we're in the sort of late stage fiat system. So as you can see, the bullet points, what happens when you keep printing money is you keep having inflation. And when you keep having inflation, you get to a situation where people don't have you erode your own purchasing power as a nation, but you also erode the purchasing power of individuals. So people who are now on what would be considered very good salaries, say 20, 30 years ago, or will be struggling to make ends meet, struggling to meet rent and struggling to pay bills. So essentially, the money you're working so hard for starts losing value, starts losing purchasing power, both at a national level and at a local level. What this then does is drive up debt. People have to borrow on a personal level, whether through credit cards or through friends and family, or at a national level, taking out huge loans. So essentially, borrowing becomes a big part of the economy. And that then comes with it borrowing costs. So essentially, you enter this downward loop where you're having to print money to survive, but the printing is driving borrowing, the borrowing is driving extra costs. So you get to situations where a large part of the national budget is going towards servicing debt, which is where we are in Britain and America right now. So that's the thing that happens then. The other thing that happens with money printing is it drives asset bubbles. So if you've owned stocks or property, and things like that, if money's printed, those things increase dramatically, right? The price, they get out of reach of ordinary people who don't own those things. So the rich get richer and the poor basically find it harder to get on the ladder. So essentially it drives inequality, right? And this is what's happened since 2020, where a lot more money was printed. Suddenly, people like Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg and Jeff Bezos, people who already had a lot of money, suddenly got a hell of a lot richer because most of that money printing benefited people who own assets, because that's what drives asset price inflation as well. So it increases wealth inequality. One of the interesting things that's happened as well is when you enter this sort of downward loop we're in, is central banks lose independence. The reason why that happens is governments are in panic mode, and what they essentially do is take over central banks and politicize the policies. Now, this happened famously in Turkey, where the central bank, as the economy got worse in Turkey, Erdogan essentially started sacking central bankers and replacing them with people that would do what he wanted to do. And then people don't see the central bank as this independent, respectable institution anymore, and are kind of suspicious of it, and they therefore don't want to invest in local currencies, even hold local currencies. So Turkey's a country I've been to quite a lot, and people often say, give us dollars, give us euros, give us pounds. We don't really want, we don't want to be paid in lira. So that's one of the things that happens. And generally, the last bullet point might be, you might think I'm overstating the case, but I do believe, and history backs me up on this, that once the currency collapses, everything else unravels as well. The trust goes away. People can't afford things, crime increases, and generally things head in a downward trajectory. And that's we're at the early stages of that now with sort of late stage fear. So next slide, please. Now, the interesting aspect of this, or the more interesting aspect of this for me, is the way it impacts the global south. So what happens in America and Europe when it comes to monetary policy has a direct impact on countries in Africa, in Latin America, in South Asia, developing countries. And this is because of a few different things. First of all, importing inflation. So many currencies are pegged to the dollar, or in the case of many African countries, pegged to the euro. Some are probably pegged to the pound as well. So if we print more of US dollars and euros, it means that things are going to become more expensive for them because we've inflated our currency, which naturally will inflate their currencies, which means if they have to import goods which are denominated in dollars, they're going to have to pay more of their currency for the same goods, right? So it means they're using up more of their currencies, using more of their reserves. This makes everything for people in those countries more expensive. And then that leads to bad economic conditions, which makes them revalue the pegs. Instead of having, say, 4 liras to a pound, it's suddenly become 5 liras to a pound, or 6 liras to a pound. So it essentially starts devaluing their currency. So essentially, we export the inflation. So this is not just inflation of currencies like the US dollar and the euro in particular have a knock-on effect. This also creates another problem. Money printing leads to inflation. Inflation leads to higher interest rates. And if you're a country that's borrowed money, like most who've got a loan from other countries, for example, you're not having to pay more interest on that loan. So again, that has a negative impact on your reserves. So basically, the money printing here doesn't stay here; it gets exported to the global south. And you've already got problems in the global south around weak banking institutions, barriers to access to banking, corruption, and people being kind of locked out of the banking system, or people simply being unbanked and locked out of the formal economy. So you already got that. And then with a deteriorating situation due to Western money printing, that's just getting a lot worse. The other thing that can happen is fiat abuse, where local elites in countries that are more corrupt, for example, will print more money to basically make themselves richer, inflate their own assets, but that then erodes the wages savings of the local people. So again, you get that wealth inequality emerging through money printing, but at a more localized level. Combined with that, you've already got the issue of high remittance costs. So many countries, like for example, people in India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, are very dependent on remittances. It's also a life-saving thing, really, for their families back home. But again, with money printing, that loses its value. And then if you've got high remittance costs, organizations like Western Union, other kind of remittance organizations already charge quite high fees. But with that as well, there's also security factors. I was talking to someone from Sri Lanka who told me that people would sit outside, gangsters basically would sit outside Western Union booths. And if they see, say, a woman collecting money every Thursday from her son is working in another country, she becomes a robbery target, right? And they'll know where she lives. They can go and they'll know she'll have some hard cash at home. So there's a security factor there as well, which again, we talk about how Bitcoin fixes that. But yeah, there's a security issue around remittance as well. So these are some of the ways in which monetary policy in the West, specifically around euros and dollars, has a direct negative impact on the global South. So if you go to the next slide, please. So I'm now going to go through what we found at Groundswell to be some key use cases for Bitcoin. And what we mean by this is how Bitcoin actually fixes some of these issues that we've talked about. And I think this is really important because Bitcoin often, if you read the mainstream press, is talked about as an asset class, as something you can buy and make some money out of. And that's all true. It is a very well-performing asset. But ultimately, what excites me about Bitcoin and what excites EverGive and Groundswell about Bitcoin is the way it can fix some of the problems that are facing people in the global South right now. So the first one is around remittances. So currently, fees typically range from 8 to 15% if you're sending money abroad via a Western Union type system. There are ways around that to make it a bit cheaper, but there's bureaucracy involved as well. It takes time as well, et cetera, et cetera. With Bitcoin, if you have lightning wallets at both ends, so if I wanted to send money to someone in Iran, for example, and I had a Bitcoin lightning wallet like Phoenix and he had a Bitcoin lightning wallet, I could send that transaction instantly. It would be like seconds of that transaction happening, and the fees will be sub 1%. It'll be a very, very low transaction fee, right? So you instantly move money at very, very low fees. That essentially puts the entire remittance sector out of business, really. They're not really needed, and then they don't need to take 10, 15% cuts every time they send a transaction, which is extortionate in my opinion. And I think that is really important because then more of the money is going into the hands. Families are keeping more of the money, it's boosting their financial resilience. And it's just allowing them to, it's allowing people to keep more of the value of their work, essentially, which I think is a really important part of this. So kind of low fee, instant, borderless transactions, which no one even has to know about. And then there's the security element to that. No one knows this transaction is happening. Local gangsters, even local governments don't know this is happening. So there's a security element to that as well. And often because it's parents in poorer areas where crime rates are high, or at least there's more insecurity around crime, that's really, really important. So remittance is a really important aspect of this. Now, we've been working with, just to make this a bit more practical, we've been working with various Afghan organizations in London. One of them in particular is supporting Afghan orphans. There's a lot of orphanages in Afghanistan because there's been a war for 30, 40 years. A lot of men died. A lot of parents died, I should say. So there's a lot of orphans in Afghanistan. So there are various organizations supporting orphanages in Afghanistan. Now, if you were to send money to these orphanages, they'd have to go through the traditional banking system, which means the Taliban will have overview of what's going on in terms of where this money is coming from, who it's going to. They'd probably want their cut as well. They want oversight. You don't really want the Taliban poking their nose in your business. So we've then helped set up, we're at the process of helping set up digital transaction, digital wallets. So if there's a digital wallet at that end, the digital wallet in London, the charity in London that can collect money typically from the Afghan diaspora community to send to the orphanages can send a Bitcoin Lightning transaction. And that way it's instant, it's cheap, and you don't have to deal with local government, in this case, the Taliban, of course, which no one wants to have to deal with, and even the local banking system, which is very corrupt as well. So that's a direct example of how Bitcoin, through solving the remittance issue, gets over a political and bureaucratic and a corruption barrier in a place like Afghanistan. So if you go to the next slide, please. Female empowerment is also a very interesting one, and something we've done a lot of work around, mainly because in countries, and I'll just give two examples of this, India and Kenya. So in India, if you're a female and trying to access finance, you're instantly deemed less money worthy by virtue of being female. That's just a cultural thing in India, really. Even though female entrepreneurs have a higher repayment rate, the facts don't really seem to matter. And similarly with Kenya, there's a lot of unbanked women in Kenya. because of ID issues and not having birth certificates. So a lot of parents don't register their daughters for birth certificates in Kenya, which means it's harder to then have the necessary ID to open a bank account. Without a bank account, running a business becomes very difficult. So this is all sorts of barriers. And there's cultural issues as well. If you go to, say, Pakistan, Bangladesh, it's harder for women to be taken seriously if they're going for a loan or setting up a bank account or getting a business loan or raising funds for a business. There's just cultural barriers to women getting involved in entrepreneurship. Now, that's really important to realize, because most of the jobs are in entrepreneurship. There isn't much of a private sector in some of these countries, so there's not like a loads of private sector jobs. And the government sector tends to be quite corrupt. So a lot of the kind of public sector jobs will go to people who've got the right political opinions, or people who voted for the right party, or people who are in with people. So there's a corruption with the government jobs, which is what led to the riots in Bangladesh earlier this year. Was the way those jobs have been given out to party loyalists, essentially, which means most people, especially in rural areas, especially those from poorer backgrounds, the only way they can make ends meet is to engage in entrepreneurship, buying and selling something. So we've been doing workshops with groups of women in northern Kenya, many who are actually Somali refugees in Kenya, and are from minority communities as well, because many of them are Muslims. And we've been training them on Bitcoin. And we believe Bitcoin essentially gets over all these cultural barriers, because if you're able to send and receive Bitcoin, you don't have to interact with the financial system at all. So if you're a female Kenyan entrepreneur in northern Kenya, selling something and people are just paying you in Bitcoin, you're accepting Bitcoin as payment, or you're receiving a loan via Bitcoin to set up your business, it doesn't really matter that you haven't got ID, that you haven't got, there's cultural barriers, or there's sexism in the system that doesn't allow you to borrow money or have a bank account. It kind of gets over those things, and especially as long as you've got internet connection and a mobile phone. So we've had a lot of success with that. We can show you some pictures later in the slide about that. But what we've found, though, is there's a lot of appetite for female entrepreneurship to embrace Bitcoin, especially in northern Kenya, where we're quite active. So we've done about 4 workshops so far. We've got a few more scheduled for early November as well. So that's a piece of work. We're very active in that particular area. If you move to the next slide, please. So direct giving is also an interesting one. We talked about this with the Afghan example, but we had this in Gambia as well, where we're in touch with a man who's building wells in Gambia. And they're not expensive. I think that's £700 to build a well, so not massively expensive. But we're supporting him to essentially create a QR code we can put on a website where people can donate directly to the well. So basically what you're doing is you're cutting out the middleman. People are able to connect to the project beneficiaries directly, which I think is really important, because the donation keeps more of its value because there's less intermediaries involved. And essentially you can get the money directly to the person. So this allows people who have projects they want to do, again, like say well building in Gambia, to just advertise their stuff online, create a QR code, you scan the QR code, you go directly to that person's digital wallet, you can donate directly to that person building the well. Right, so this direct giving is really important. Now that's particularly important in areas where, again, there's political corruption. There's, like Afghanistan, you've got a government like the Taliban that you don't really want involved in your business. You don't want them to know what you're doing. There's a financial system that's probably corrupt that you don't fully trust, that might have very high fees. Also accessibility. If they're building a well in a rural area, it's a bit harder to get the money there without people having to travel to cities and access banks. So it solves a lot of problems, be able to just give money directly to the person you want to benefit. And again, Bitcoin can do that. If you go to the next slide, please. So this again goes back to the female empowerment piece. One thing we trained women in northern Kenya recently. A lot of them had business ideas, and a lot of them had ideas they wanted to scale. Like we met a woman who was making her own spices and selling them in the local market, essentially. But what they lack, especially if they're in a rural area and they don't have access to banking, is finance, is capital to basically scale up their business. I'm not talking about huge amounts of money, just like small amounts of finance. So one thing we're looking at is microfinance. So microfinance is very interesting. So microfinance was pioneered in Bangladesh by the man who's now the leader of Bangladesh, Muhammad Yunus. So during this, shortly after the war with Pakistan, Bangladesh was previously East Pakistan, and it was East and West Pakistan essentially. Then there was a war, and I won't go into the details of the war, but there was a war, and Bangladesh became independent. And Bangladesh, because prior to the war, was very heavily dependent on West Pakistani grain and flour imports. So after the war, it became a very poor country because they didn't really have a self-sufficient agricultural base. So it also became the testing ground for a lot of economic ideas from different people around the world. One of the ideas that worked was microfinance. So the way microfinance works is you get a pool of people, let's say 5 people, who typically are family or close friends or live in the same village, and you give them all a small amount of money. But everyone is responsible for everyone else's money. So if one person defaults, the rest have to make up for that, right? So if you give 5 people £50 each, if one guy does a runner, everyone now has to pay £60, £70 each, have to make up. So they're all responsible for each other's loans, which means they're all invested in making sure everyone invests it well and pays it back. If they collectively pay back the money they borrowed, they can then access more money. That can go to, say, £70, then £80, and £90. So this way, you slowly start injecting capital into rural areas, which people can use to invest, typically in farm equipment or something that's going to allow them to make a living. And it had a very high repayment rate. It was a huge success story and really helped Bangladesh get back on its feet. So we're looking at a Bitcoin version of this, which has been done before. It's not a completely new thing, but essentially how you can create a Bitcoin smart contract where people can access, groups of people can access a certain amount of Bitcoin, which they can then invest in a business idea. And if they pay back the Bitcoin, then they can get more Bitcoin. So essentially you can slowly start helping scale businesses via microfinance. So we're putting the first team of people together, which includes the woman who's making the spices. We're finding a few other entrepreneurs, getting them together, then saying, okay, how much capital would really help you scale your business? And then we can do that via Bitcoin. And again, doing it via Bitcoin is so beautiful because we'd have to get involved, have a banking relationship, and then get involved in a complex financial institution that will have its all sorts of, documents and fees. And there's a lot of bureaucracy that will come with that, a lot of costs that will come with that. Whereas with Bitcoin, small organizations like us in North London can suddenly start helping someone in Kenya directly. So it's this peer-to-peer thing that I think is so wonderful. People can start having impact with each other, peer-to-peer, without having to engage political players and complex financial institutions. So it's that instantness of it that I think is really exciting. So next slide, please, Richard. So here's some pictures. So this is our session in northern Kenya. So the lady in the top left there, Hanan Ibrahim, she's actually spent most of her life in London, and she's actually got an OBE or an MBE, one of those. Anyway, she's holding some of the spice jars that I talked about earlier. But this essentially is 3 of our sessions. The one in the bottom right is another session, which is delivered by a local guy, Phoenix. He's a very active Bitcoin educator. He lives in Kenya. But these are just images of the workshops they're doing with women. Most of them, I shouldn't say I was surprised, but I was a bit surprised by just how keen they were to learn this. Because I thought I was worried I was going to be boring them talking about Bitcoin and money, and I thought I was thinking, this is even interesting for these people. But at the end of it, with the questions we got, they were really, really interested because we were instantly. They got it before I did. That they got instantly how this can fix problems, and it's important to note that. If you live in Britain and you've got a currency that's relatively stable, the pound, we don't really see currency as a problem because it's kind of the banks work, the money is relatively stable, even though there's some inflation. It's not a problem in our daily lives. But if you talk to people who in a country like Argentina is a good example of this, or Turkey, where inflation's a real issue. Like you can get money one day and it's lost 30% of its value the next day, or access to banks is a real issue, access to finance is a real issue. They get Bitcoin very quickly. It doesn't take long for them to say, I can see what the problems this is solving instantly, because they are real problems that they're actually living with on a day-to-day basis. So they got it very, very quickly. And from the questions we got from them, we got so much enthusiasm and so much ideas of what could be done next with this. So we're going to continue doing a series of sessions with the same group of women. And hopefully that will lead to use cases emerging from that, either in terms of direct giving, in terms of remittances, or in terms of microfinance, so they can scale up businesses. So we're looking at those 4 as key ways in which Bitcoin can really, really help people. But yeah, it's work I'm very excited to be involved with. Is that the last slide, Richard? Okay. I quickly want to mention mining, because someone at the last session raised a question about Bitcoin mining. Now, I'm not a techie, so and Bitcoin mining is a very technical process. But I'll try to explain how Bitcoin mining works. So Bitcoin is mined, essentially, is the way the system is created. So you have something called the blockchain. If you imagine data, like let's say there's lots of transactions with Bitcoin, all of the data from those transactions forms a block. right? So you block it all, you put it all together. You can put like, let's say you got 1,000 transactions and movements of Bitcoin, and that forms a digital block. You then have to attach that digital block to another block, right? So this then becomes what's called the blockchain. It's a chain of blocks, essentially, that's completely transparent. Anyone in the world can look into these blocks, look at all those transactions. There won't be any ID of the individuals involved, but it creates this transparent blockchain of transactions that's decentralized, which means it's people who run nodes, people who are part of the Bitcoin project, if you like. They are all sharing this data. They're all sharing the access to this and running this project. Now, when you attach a block to the existing blockchain, there's a code that's needed to allow. Imagine that code is like the glue that will allow that block to attach itself to the next block, right? And then people who are miners have to guess, and that glue will be a number. It could be like 10 noughts and 6 threes, and it's like basically like a number. Miners have to guess what that number is, basically. And whoever guesses it correctly is then rewarded with Bitcoin. Bitcoin is then released to that person, right? So then you need a lot of computing power because you're running a lot of guesses a second, right? So the more computing power you have, the more attempts you can go at it. And eventually someone will get the right number. Everyone else will confirm that that is the right number because it works. Then Bitcoin is released to that person, right? That's basically how new Bitcoin is created. So it's a very energy intensive process. But what that's actually leading to, because there was a panic a few years ago about, oh, Bitcoin's consuming so much energy. What that's leading to is a lot of investment in clean energy production, because there's an incentive to produce clean energy now. So in El Salvador, there's volcanic energy. In Iceland, they're using thermal energy. In Africa, Gridless, for example, one of the organizations we work with, they're using water to generate energy. So it's leading to the huge investment in clean and renewable energy, because you can use that energy to mine Bitcoin and get paid for producing energy. So I think over time, Bitcoin mining is helping usher in a clean energy revolution as well, because again, it's creating the incentive for pretty much anyone, anywhere in the world to produce clean energy, because they're getting paid to make clean energy, right? And use existing energy to mine Bitcoin rather than the energy getting lost and not being badly stored. So that is, I will send a video that's kind of an animation of Bitcoin mining that explains it in 3 minutes, but that's essentially what it is. But I can't go into too much more detail because it's a very technical process. But essentially, it's guessing the code that will connect to the blockchains and then releasing rewards. So that's how Bitcoin is created. But the blockchain reward decreases every 4 years. This is called the halving. So currently it's 3.125. Then in 2028 it'll become half of that, and half. They'll keep becoming half. So the reward gets less every 4 years, but that means the price will also go up. So the scarcity is increasing. So that leads to more price pressure. So even the reward will decrease, the actual value will increase, if you know what I mean. And that's one of the ways in which the price is stabilized, by the reward going down. It's like anti-inflationary, sort of deflationary, if you like. Okay, I'm aware I've said a lot there, put a lot out there, so I'll stop there, Richard. And
I think you've done a very good job there of trying to explain something very complex in 2 minutes. And the video will be perfect. We can share that with everyone on this call as well. We have got a few other questions split between yourself and Ishmael. So I'll come to Ishmael first, just around about EverGive and the decision to invest in Bitcoin. And one of the questions we've received is whether or not EverGive will ever invest in other cryptocurrencies. Will it just be Bitcoin, and what's helped make that decision? So if I could go back over to Ishmael to answer that, would be fantastic.
Hey, thanks for that. And thanks for that, Gafar. Yeah, so we are, the specific problem that we're trying to solve for is how do we retain the value of the donation forever. So the only technology that we're satisfied achieves that over the long term is Bitcoin. So we wouldn't be going into any other cryptocurrency or any other asset for that reason. There's a blog on our website, Rich, that you might be able to share after this, that goes into some detail on why Bitcoin and why not things like gold, like real estate, etc. So yeah, but put simply, we wouldn't be going into any other assets for the foreseeable future.
Perfect. Another thing we'll share with everyone on this call. I'll stay with you, Ishmael. Someone wants to know whether you've really thought about your 5-year plan and whether or not you think that this type of future proofing will become mainstream as other businesses sort of see what EverGive are doing and sort of look to copy.
In terms of whether we've thought through it, yes. But if there's anything particular about our thinking, happy to kind of unpack it. But do I think that this will be mainstream? I think it will be inevitable. I think it will have to be mainstream. If you look at all of like the sweeping cuts and the austerity all around the world, particularly in the US, but locally here too, the UK government's proposing to cut over £20 billion in welfare spending. There's just no other sustainable way other than charities starting to become a lot more financially responsible and building out their own kind of independence and becoming more resilient. So I think there will be kind of a pendulum swing to charities feeling like they can rely less on the public donations or institutions even, and relying more on themselves. And that's already happening, right? So if the charity sector is to respond appropriately to kind of the current events, the ones who survive will adopt this strategy, I think.
Wonderful. We'll time for one more question. It's the same question that's going to be posed slightly differently to both yourself, Ishmael, and to Gafar. So maybe we start with you, Ishmael, to finish off. What surprised you the most since launching EverGive?
I think a number of things, but the main thing that surprised me really is how open people have been and the reception to what we're doing from both the public. You've seen that we've got over like 20, I think almost 30,000 donors without any kind of marketing spend. And charities alike are a lot more open to this because we've been in Bitcoin for some time now and been through kind of the various ups and downs and the bad PR that it's got. But just to see Bitcoin where it's at right now and seeing people's reception to what we're doing has just been kind of the biggest surprise. But yeah, and also just how, although it sounds, if you go into the technical detail of Bitcoin under the hood, it might be quite complicated. But in terms of it's quite simply put, what it's doing is making sure that charities don't get poorer as a result of inflation and debasement that Gafar spoke about, and retaining its value, and for donors making their impact last longer than it otherwise would. As really, really strongly, a lot more strongly than we expected. I mean, we're currently running experiments where we're integrating a widget into charity websites, and we're seeing north of 1 in 5 donors leave a contribution for a charity just because they resonate with the idea of having their impact become more sustainable. So yeah, it's been overwhelming to see how well people have responded to it. That's been kind of like the biggest surprise to me.
Wonderful. And then Gafar, it's the same sort of question to yourself, posed slightly differently. But what has surprised you the most working with Groundswell project and being so connected to Bitcoin? What's the thing that's been surprising the most in the sort of sector that you've seen?
The thing that's really struck me is how, I mean, previously how little people think about money. Money is just this thing that's just there, and it's not people are not supposed to question it. People are not supposed to think about it as a concept, and therefore we just accept the financial system as it is, rather than saying, actually, why are we relying on paper money that the government can just print and deflate away? You know, why can't we have a different system? And how that's not even taught in schools, how it's never a discussion point at any point in your life. You know, if you go through your education journey, I did A-levels, I did a degree, I did a master's. At no point does someone talk about money in any of that education journey. And then when you start working, I've worked in different industries. At no point does anyone mention, well, what's money? Well, how can we think of money differently? So it's that really surprises me that we don't think about money in a more creative way, and therefore we're not spending time thinking of alternative ways in which we can move value around. And there are better ways of moving value around than pounds and dollars, but we're not ever allowed to think in that way. So I think, for me to start thinking that differently and then helping other people to think about transferring and storing value differently is just been such a, what's the term for this, isn't there? conscientious. There's a term for it where you don't know something before and suddenly start thinking about it differently. A conscientious raiser, I think it's called, raising consciousness, I think. So it's that's really surprised me is how little people know about just basic economics, really. Now, I'm not saying I'm an economics expert or anything like that, but I'm far from it. But people are so economically literate in Britain and in Europe and America. It's something we're just not allowed to think about or not encouraged to even think about. And I think it's really important that we do start thinking about it, because it will help solve a lot of the problems we have. If we start thinking more creatively about money, value, economics, I think it's really important.
Wonderful. Thank you for that response. So there's no more questions yet. If any other people on the call or who watches back afterwards have questions, please get them into us. We'll look to answer them all. But that brings the end of the session. A big thank you to Gafar for joining us over the 2 sessions, and Ishmael for joining us today and sharing the stories. Appreciate your time and engagement. And what we'll do is we'll post the recording onto our YouTube, share it on socials. So please do share when you see that. But thank you again. And obviously we'll see you all again next time.